Welcome to Shift, a college admissions ACT, SAT, and CLT podcast for a changing world. I'm Tyler, founder of Achievable, and we have affordable ACT and CLT courses that include everything you need to ace your exam. A full textbook, tons of review questions backed by our memory enhancing algorithm, videos on key topics, a built in study planner, and full length practice exams. You can get a free trial at achievable.me, and if you like it, the code podcast will get you 10% off at checkout. Now, let's get started. Today, we've got Christina Chestnut with us. Christina, I'd love if you could introduce yourself.
Yeah, thank you for having me, Tyler. So, my name's Christina Chestnut. I have been working in tutoring and test prep for almost 20 years now. And so I've seen everything when it comes to these tests. But I'm based in the New York area, but I work with people all over the world. I work one-on-one with students on both math and verbal sides. And I also work with kids on writing, but that's like a separate thing. So anyway, but I am both an expert in the content of the test, the strategy of the test, and in learning itself. And so that, I can talk about that a little bit more later, but the idea is that, I really try to bring all of that to the table when I work with students.
Great. Yeah, and so today we're going to be talking about, what you should be expecting when you start studying for these standardized tests. These tests being the ACT, SAT, and now CLT, which are the tests that basically are for undergraduate admissions into colleges, assuming that you're submitting a test score. But I think for most competitive colleges now, that's pretty much what you want to be doing. And I feel like everyone who is listening to this podcast knows what these tests are, right? Probably.
Hmm.
And they also probably have a rough idea of what they're getting into already. So when we talked about this topic and talked about saying what to expect going into this, I feel like you had sort of specific ideas in mind, like maybe it's not going to be quite what you think, right? And here's where you wanted to challenge what assumptions people had. So I'd love if you could start us off with that.
So I'll frame it a little bit to answering the questions that I often get when I first meet a new family who wants to talk about test prep. So, just to see some misconceptions, but also some just things to expect. So the first thing is that I always tell people this is probably going to take 3 to 6 months, and you're probably going to
Mhm.
need to take the test twice. Because I think a lot of people want it to be like 6 weeks and done, or they think they're going to spend the rest of their life working on test prep, right? But it really, to me, test prep is about getting the test done to the level that you need to move on with your life, right?
Mhm.
Like this is not an end, it is a means to an end. And therefore, that's the way we want to treat it, right? Like these tests can be very stressful, they can take up a lot of time with studying. And the idea is like, hey, why don't we try to minimize the stress and get this done as quickly as possible, so that you can do the other things, right? Move on with your life, do a new club that you want to found, or, maybe there's an A- that can turn into an A on your report card by taking those hours and working on that instead, right? So I really try to help people focus on this not being the ticket to college, but being a step on the way there, but that the important thing is the kid developing themselves.
Mhm. Yeah, and let's talk about that. What does that mean to you, like the kid developing themselves?
I think it speaks a little bit to the what I was saying before about, like, let's say the SAT not being the means to an end, right? So let's say,
Hmm.
you have your sights set on, a very competitive college, and you're like, okay, well, I need a really high score to get into that, school. And let's say you study really
Hmm.
hard, you get, let's say, a 1510, right? That's a great score, right? Everyone can agree that
Hmm.
that's a really good score, right? But maybe you're like, but if I had a 1520, maybe then that would be even better, right?
Hmm.
So the question you have to ask yourself is like, is it worth all of the time, energy, stress, of taking the test and then waiting for your scores when, having a 1510 will at almost any university in this country and even internationally get your application read.
Hmm.
So that extra 10 points probably is not going to get you into the school. It's already, you already have your 1510. You'll already get your application read. So why keep studying? Right? Like, what
Hmm.
if you could do some other really cool thing, like become the president of that club that you've been excited about, or, do a new
Right.
volunteer project, right? Like, that says a whole new thing about you that's not reflected if you've only just gotten to get that 15-20, right? So,
Hmm.
that's not to say good scores aren't helpful, but they aren't the be all and end all. They're not the thing that's going to get you in. They're the thing that's going to get your application read. And then it's everything else that you do that's going to get you into
Hmm.
college, right?
I think that's a good like thing to challenge people on, especially because at the end of the day, I think that a lot of people get really hung up on, I basically I need this score. And it's like you need something in the ballpark of that score, right? But yeah, like you said, it's really about like the best way to maximize the time that you have
Mhm.
to get the best outcome. So then let's talk a little bit about, let's say, this is going to go out to people that are maybe at the start of their standardized testing journey, right? What's the first thing that you talk to parents about? What are you trying to kind of get their mind wrapped around? Like you mentioned, it's going to be 3 to 6 months. You're going to take the test twice, but then beyond that, what kind of schedule are you talking about? What kind of structure are you putting in place? Those kind of things.
Well, I think the next like important thing that, I think is good for parents and students to understand is the importance of practice tests, right?
Hmm.
So, and that means like starting the program by taking a full practice test, right? Let's get a score that we can start with, right? Because not only does that give us a starting point, which can help us
Hmm.
understand what might be reasonable as an ending point, but also it can give us a sense of what are the strengths, what are the weaknesses, how do we use the strengths to shore up the weaknesses, and give us an idea
Hmm.
of where to start working, right? So when I work with students, I always try to start with the weakest point first, right? And then kind of build up from there. And so having a diagnostic test at the beginning allows us to do that, right? And
Hmm.
then having regular practice testing throughout, because even though that's stressful, even though it takes some time, right, because you have to commit to sitting for the full test, it gives us another data point. It gives us a sense of what's working, what's not working, what do we still need to work on, what now that we've done some content, what strategically might need to change so that you can still be successful. And it can also
Hmm.
give us an idea of whether the timeline that we might have set out at the beginning is reasonable or it needs to change, right? Like, if the scores
Hmm.
aren't coming up as quickly as we want to see, or if they're coming up really fast, like, does that mean we want to test earlier than we thought? But again, with the idea of like, let's not make this the rest of your life, right? I always
Yeah.
guide people to have, like try to have something to work toward a test date in the next few months, because otherwise it can be this really thankless task. And you need
Hmm.
the kid to care, right? And if there's no test data.
Well, and you need to like, I don't know, as a parent, like spend your political points with your child on certain things, right? Like you can't just
Right.
demand that they are a robot that does everything that you want.
Mhm. Yeah,
Yeah.
I totally agree. And yeah, so that's a big thing as well, is definitely those diagnostic tests, because as I said, like it can also pinpoint other things that need to be worked on, like what if timing is an issue, or what if the fact that you're in a different place means that you're stressed in a different way, which means that then you might not perform as well as you do at home in your bedroom when you're like sitting in your bed, like so all of that can really come from practice testing. um
Yeah, and I think it's also just important to remember that, it's a process and, processes are things that you kind of like work on, right? For lack of a better word, like consider it your new hobby for the next, like, I don't know, 3 to 6 months. It's something like, it's like if you were practicing guitar, right? Like you wouldn't play the song correctly once and then be like, okay, I'm done. I learned it now.
yeah, exactly.
Right? Like
Yeah.
you would need to do it over and over again. And I just think that a lot of people kind of are like, they have one good practice test that hits their target score and they're like, cool, that was it. Now I'll go take the real one in 2 weeks. And it's like, okay, it's going to be harder when you take the real one. Like you're going to be stressed. It's going to be weird. You're going to be in a room with a bunch of people.
Mm-hmm.
Somebody's probably going to annoy you with whatever they're doing.
The pencil
Um,
tapping, the proctor pacing at the front of the room, like, you never know.
yeah, yeah, and I mean, I think that's actually a good thing to touch on real quick. I mean, I think we should just maybe dig in on a couple of specifics, right? One of those, I mean, just because it's relevant, it's not in order, but is how to practice,
Yeah.
right?
Mhm.
I think, you know, your practice tests have to be basically as close to the real experience as you can get, which doesn't mean that you're going to round up a bunch of your friends to tap their pencils, but it does mean that you need to take a timed practice test. And you probably need to take it in your living room or in your kitchen or something where there's like a little bit of distraction going on. Obviously, if you're like brothers playing video games, that's way too much distraction.
Right.
But, you know, a quiet room, but a room that is not, you know, your bedroom by yourself completely alone, so you can get used to the whole idea. Do you have any other advice kind of like that for
Yeah,
just kind of
absolutely.
mentally preparing?
So in some places there will, different companies might host a practice test even at like a local high school or something like that. But if you're not in a place where that's possible, I often recommend going to a public library, right? And just find a
Hmm.
study table, right? You can go back in the stacks, find yourself a quiet spot, but it offers a similar amount of slightly uncomfortable distraction that is not dissimilar from what you would see in a practice test, right? Or like even in a real,
Hmm.
because you might hear other people turning pages, you might hear the shuffling of feet, like, behind the next bookcase, or, you could even hear doors opening and closing, like as people come in and out of the library, but it's pretty quiet, right? Like people don't tend to be loud in libraries. Um,
Hmm.
so, and it's not at home, right? So, like, mom isn't gonna walk in and be like, "Little Johnny, what do you want for lunch?" Not
Right. Yeah.
realizing
Yeah.
you're doing that or whatever. So that can also be nice. And funny enough, I've actually had students who told me after they took their first practice test, not at home, whether it was at a library or at a testing center, they'll be like, "Oh my god, that was so great," because I didn't have all the normal things annoying me, like my phone going off next to me and this and that. Like, they actually
Hmm.
felt that they could really focus, which in this day and age is now like a bigger thing that people have to practice. But yeah, so that
Hmm.
that can definitely be a good option as a library.
Yeah, I like that a lot. And then just, you know, again, we're a little bit out of order, but let's talk about practical tips for building a study plan. And then, yeah, just like kind of digesting all the material, right? I mean, when you're building a study plan, what do you think is the first step? Is it triaging what you know and don't know, or is it taking a practice test, or what do you like to do?
Well, so what I think makes sense is like first a diagnostic test, right? Just see, okay, now seen the whole thing. I can kind of get a sense for what it is all about. So the first level I think that needs to get sort of achieved is knowing the material, right? So content comes first.
Hmm.
Because you have to know the grammar rules, you have to know the math formulas, you have to know sort of the basics of how the questions are asked. That's the very first thing you have to master, right? A lot of students come to me and they want to go fast right away. And I'm like, that's
Hmm.
not the first step, because think about it, like, if you're learning to drive a car, do you just immediately get on a highway and then expect to know how
Hmm.
to handle it and all this stuff? No, you start by going on the
Right.
small roads, you like go 10 miles an hour and everyone's honking at you and it's a nightmare, but like the point is you got to go slow to learn how the car works before you go fast on the highway. So once you kind of start to master that content, then I like to introduce some measures of like, okay, so let's feel what it feels like to limit ourselves to the amount of time that you would normally have, right? So then maybe
Hmm.
we might take one section at a time, right? Time that out, see how it feels, right? And if there's no issue, right? Like let's say a kid can finish the English section, no problem, they never run out of time, then we don't need to put in timing constraints, right? But if you're running out of time consistently, that's when I start to kind of help kids create a timing plan for themselves, right? Like when I come
Hmm.
across, let's say, the five question passage in English, this is how much time I should have, or the 10 question passage, this is how much time I should have. This is how long I have on a reading passage, right? Um, so that's when we bring that in, but that's secondary, right? So I tend to find content comes first, strategy comes second. And that tends to work well for students, right? Because one of the things that a lot of people find is as you practice the content, you actually end up getting faster, right? Like, because you now know what to expect. You know what you're doing. You don't have to like scramble to think, oh, hey, what was the formula again? Or, oh, like, I forget what this grammar structure is, right? You don't have to do that thinking. It becomes more automatic. And so then you can go
Hmm.
ahead and just, move more quickly because you don't have to think as hard initially when you reach each problem.
Yeah. Yeah. And I mean, that's like the main thing you want to set up, right? Like you want to have this feel like a thing that you're going through and you're like, oh yeah, I know how to do this, and you do it. And you, oh yeah, I know how to do this, and you do it, right? I mean, what advice do you have for people like kind of identifying and then practicing the different question types?
Yeah, so I mean, for that, there's different ways you can do it. So if you, for instance, are buying like a published book or for the SAT or like, using their, the College Board Blue Book software or whatever, each question is assigned a type, right? And those tend to be like kind of general, but they are broken down at least a little bit more than this is an English question, this is a math question. So what you can do is you can actually, then look up more questions of that kind. I've never done this myself, but I have had students who have gone into like ChatGPT and been like, can you give me more questions that are that like the SAT type of this, right? And then it'll just
Hmm.
create questions. Now, again, I don't know if it how good they are, but there is also a whole database of questions out there that the SAT has written that you can also draw from. So what I would say is like don't just let it sit on I got this question wrong, but then try to do the research of what type of question it is, then learn the topic, right? Using, you might need to use the internet to help you find what topic it is, and then practice more questions like it so that you really feel like you know the topic. Because just letting it be, I got this one wrong, okay, I'm going to move on with my life,
Hmm.
doesn't help you for next time. Right? And the whole idea is next time is when you need to get it right.
Right. Yeah, that makes sense. Well, and it's also like you should really be learning how to get it right kind of all the time.
Mhm,
Because even if you are getting it right all the time, there will probably be some kind of curveball
mhm.
later or like on the real test. Mm.
As my students get
Yeah, go ahead.
stronger, honestly, what I tell them to do is mark questions even that they like were 50-50 on, because I want to know that so that if they even got it right, that we talk about the concept behind it so that then next time it's not a fifty
Hmm.
fifty anymore, that we know why it's actually the right answer. Because if you're especially aiming for those really strong, really high scores, you have to do that hard work of even for the right ones that you were a little bit unsure about, you have to keep pushing until you really know what they're asking.
Hmm. Yeah, great. And is there anything else that we haven't covered yet? Is there anything that you want to make sure that we mention before we wrap up?
I mean, the only like one thing just to throw out there is the importance of homework, right? I get this question a lot from like parents want homework for their kids, kids don't want the homework. But what I would say is
Hmm.
doing the homework means that you can do the questions by yourself. Okay. And so it's important to do it because you need to be able to do it by yourself, right? Not just with a tutor or with your buddy or whatever. Like you need to have that confidence in yourself as a student in order to be successful on these tests. And, the other thing I would just throw out there is like there can be some great like classes out there and apps and stuff like that. They will generally, they're going to tell you so much information. But if you
Hmm.
want to like have a more personalized approach, then that's when people will hire tutors or they'll hire, something like that is to have to really address their specific needs and concerns, right? And so
Hmm.
thinking about making that choice, because I know that's a choice that a lot of families confront, that's something you want to think about when you're making that decision is like, what do you need? What are your goals? And, how do
Hmm.
you think you can get there?
Yeah, exactly. And I mean, That's why even though, we don't do tutoring, we have a tutor directory because I think we just get a lot of people that ask.
Yeah.
And it's like, I think everyone needs different things.
Hmm.
And it also is like maybe you just need help with like one specific problem type or one specific part of the test. So you can get most of your work done with a course, and then you can go to a tutor for specific things, or you can have a tutor, A to Z if you are willing to do that.
Absolutely.
So there's plenty of support out there.
Hmm. Yeah.
Well, great. Well, thank you so much. This has been Shift, a college admissions podcast for a changing world, hosted by Tyler from Achievable with Christina Chestnut from Chestnut Consulting. And you can get a free trial of Achievable's ACT and CLT courses by going to achievable.me.